So every once in a while somebody wants to know why I left psychology or why I push back against the social sciences. And the answer is that they use crappy data collection techniques and they don't really do proper design of experiments. It's hard. I get that. Unfortunately, not doing those things actually causes a lot of damage. It's actually very harmful. And one of the best cases of that is demonstrated by the social justice movement. I don't believe the social justice movement is intentionally harming people. They really do believe racism and sexism exists. The problem is that they fundamentally ignore personal choice, and that leads to discrepant outcomes, and that would be indistinguishable from their racism or sexism or whatever it is that they want to actually push as part of their agenda. And when you try to point out that there are differences in these groups to start with, and that we should expect differences in outcomes because of those differences in those groups, you get this pushback that you don't believe that racism or sexism exists, and that's not really what I said at any point in this conversation. I do believe that racism exists. I do believe that sexism exists. I've met people who are racist, and I've met people who are sexist, but they are few and far between. The idea that that leads to a systemic injustice is far less likely than actual discrepancies between the groups being monitored. To the lawyer's credit, he linked me to an ACLU study which showed that African Americans are stopped at a higher rate than white people. The problem that I had with the study is that it didn't control for two confounding variables which actually correlate to race. One is income, and that's going to determine how well you can maintain and upkeep your vehicle, more or less how many code violations it's going to have on it at any given time. The second is going to be crime rate. Because police aren't distributed randomly in a city, they tend to be focused in areas that are more problematic. They're going to be sent out on calls more frequently to those areas, and thus there's going to be a higher police presence there. So if you happen to have a car that has more code violations and you happen to be in an area where there's more police, the probability of being stopped is significantly higher. The social justice movement and some members of the African American community have taken this expected outcome and turned it into evidence of racism. And then that gets taught to kids, minority kids, that their interactions with police are going to be based off of racial profiling. It's not that you're driving a shit car through a crap neighborhood, it's that you're driving while black. And unfortunately, that ideology is self-reinforcing simply because our interactions with police are generally not overly pleasant. They don't come giving you hugs and candy, they come giving you summons and tickets and fines. And, I have experienced all of those things. The reality is that when you start challenging people who are pushing this ideology, inevitably it comes down to the idea of the black experience. And that's really where we have to base this off of instead of data. So inevitably, somebody wants to turn around and talk about this racial experience, and it's supposed to be this trump card against white people. How can you possibly know what we're talking about? You don't know what it's like to be black, and that's true, I don't. But at the same time, anybody who wants to push that fucking agenda, well, they don't know what it's like to be white. We don't know what the racial experience of another individual is because we aren't that race. That's the truth. So there's two ways that we can sit there and talk about this, and one is to either have controlled studies and controlled data, which, as demonstrated earlier, we don't, and the other is to basically compare notes. And this kid offered me this case where a cop ticketed him for having an out tag light when it really wasn't. Well, I've had out brake lights when they weren't that I got ticketed for. I even turned around and tapped it as the cop was walking back to the car because I just replaced it. And pointed it out that it was reflecting off his badge, and he turned around and he looked, and he said, "Yep, looks like it's working now. Must have been a faulty wiring." I don't know how that happened. I've gotten tickets for traveling, a $150 ticket for traveling in the left-hand lane of a 2-lane highway. I've had a cop turn around and pull me over on a dark, unlit road. He walked around the car with his flashlight numerous times, noticed my inspection sticker had just expired, and turned around and said that he pulled me over for it, even though there's no possible way he could have seen it at night. I had a cop turn around and confiscate a bottle of liquor from a time that I was a designated driver. I was a 21-year-old, or a 20-year-old, and this bottle was confiscated from a 21-year-old adult who was in the car with me. He'd had 3 beers already, had 2 DUIs on his record. His license was currently confiscated, and my choice was to either let him drive or take him to the liquor store myself. They use this concept of constructive possession, even though the 21-year-old adult who was in the car with me at the time said he owned the bottle. It was unopened, and it was in his physical possession at the time. Because of this constructive possession law in the state of Maine, I now permanently have on my record minor with transportation. And these are my experiences. I've been pulled over numerous times for various things, from inspection stickers to basically having a guy follow me for 1.5 miles with his lights off because he wanted to do a drunk check. I was driving away from a college campus, and so he thought I was drunk when I was with my wife. I've had cops sit down and write on a ticket that they guessed and measured my speed limit, the speed I was traveling at, and they said that I was going 72 in a 40-mile-an-hour zone. It was actually Route 93 in Boston. That road, that highway, doesn't actually drop below 55. So I've had cops make shit up. I've had cops sit there and give me tickets for things. I've had to fight numerous tickets for things. God knows they can do predatory policing, but it has nothing to do with race, and this is my experience. It's not that cops are sitting there and being nice, it's that they are, in fact, out to get you. Another experience that I had with a cop, well, I actually was talking to a state trooper. My wife was at work. He was just monitoring the road construction project. Some woman with a Suburban just blew right past him and the crew guys. She didn't feel like waiting, so she drove up, nearly hit another car, and kept on going. He'd caught her license plate, but she didn't stop for him. And he was actually going through the code book to try to find every single infraction that she had, and he was going to be mailing her the ticket. So yeah, cops do have a ton of discretion, and they absolutely will nail you to the wall for whatever the frig they want. There is always something on the books at any time that they can stop you for, and they will, and it has nothing to do with your race. So inevitably somebody wants to bring up things like stop and frisk in the drug war. Well, if you want to ask my opinion of it, stop and frisk should be banned because it violates your Fourth Amendment rights. There shouldn't be a war on drugs, because if you want to put something in your body, it is of no business of mine whether you do or don't. It's no different than the sexual habits of other individuals or whatever the fuck else you want to do as an adult. If that led to crime or increased crime, the reality is that we need to put the people who are committing the crimes away, and it's not caused by these substances. A drug doesn't make you go do something. You do it of your own accord, whether it's to feed your habit or not. But that's also not racism. The reality is that police deployment to areas of high crime is going to result in more stop and frisks in those areas, which is again correlated to race. And as for drug use, this comes from this idea that white people and black people use drugs at the same rate, and that's not entirely correct. Again, there's no shortage of people who actually want to blame racism on stuff. And, you can find articles out there that talk about how white people and black people have used drugs at the same rate. Some white people have actually used more, and that's not the same thing as to who is going to get arrested by it. See, that's going to be tied to the frequency of usage. How many times have you used it? How many times do you use it? What is your frequency of being high? And we actually, the study did ask that. So if we go to number of days used cocaine in the past 12 months and we change it to race and ethnicity, well, what we find is that there is a trend. The chronic usage, and this goes across drugs, I've actually tested this with all of the different drug charts, race does seem to correlate with chronic use, with black people more chronically using the drug. And yes, you're going to have more usage by white people overall for most drugs, but they aren't using it all the time. The study only goes to about the past 100 or more than 100 days of use in the past 12 months, so that would be once every 3 days. But if this trend continued into once every day or who is high all the fucking time, which we don't have data on, but that would very much make a huge difference in who is likely to get caught with drugs. Then there's other questions that have to come up. What is the probability that you're walking around with drugs? And that may be difference between the racial groups, is how they choose to do their drugs. And again, this study doesn't account for it. But if you were to factor out crime rates and police deployment, and you were to factor out poverty and those kinds, and drug use associated with poverty, and then you were to sit there and go, oh, well, who's high all the fucking time? And if that was an uptick here, which it looks like based on this and all the other data in the study set, that there is a racial discrepancy between chronic use and the percent of people who are chronic users, well, then you're more likely to get caught with it, because that's what it is. It's a probability of all of these interactions taking place. What's the likelihood you have drugs? What's the likelihood you're in an area that the police are going to be in? What's the likelihood that you're doing something suspicious? And if you're high all the fucking time, well, and you have drugs on you, well, you're going to look kind of suspicious. So that gives them the opportunity to stop and frisk, and that's not racism. That's just policing. In the beginning, I pointed out that social science and they tend to sit there and push this narrative without actually having the fact and evidence, and it's causing harm. And the best evidence of that is from your 2013 hate crime statistics. 24% of all the people committing hate crimes are African American, and they only represent 12 to 13% of the population. They're literally twice as represented as hate crime committers as they should be. So if you're going to tell me that going to a group of individuals and saying that all of your social woes, all of your social problems, you're not at fault for anything. It's all them racist white people. It's all them racist cops. It's this bigoted, biased, oppressive society. Well, this is the damage that you're doing. You're harming people. They're being assaulted. They're being killed. They're raped, any one of those things, and they are putting other people behind bars because you're trying to motivate people with this race-baiting, hateful speech that's not actually based in actual fact. So another example is that the overall line of duty deaths have gone down 24%, but the number of gunfire deaths has gone up 36%. Maybe it's not related. I doubt that, though, considering the amount of hate speech which has been directed at police officers and the accusations of racism which has been directed at police officers. And that's not going to end well for either the shooter or the cop, and yet here we are. This is a consequence of race baiting. This passing the buck and pointing the finger at oppression and systemic injustice when it's not there also prevents us from having an open and honest discussion about crime problems as it varies across racial groups. This is FBI's Table 43. It's crimes broken down by race. And I took the data and put it into this table here. It's right here. And this is the actual black commission rate, assuming that we were to standardize the populations. You're looking at 6 times more murders and manslaughters, 2.5 times more rapes, 7 times more robberies, 2.8 times as many aggravated assaults, almost 2.5 times as many burglaries. It isn't until you start getting down to like alcohol-related offenses, which is a large portion of it, that white people really make it up. This is more white people getting arrested for driving under the influence. This is more white people getting arrested for violating liquor laws, and about parity for drunkenness. Some of these things you might be able to claim are definitely racially biased. I would say suspicion and curfew and loitering law violations is probably not very effective, but again, the actual violent crimes, your murders, your rapes, your robberies, beating your children, it's all there. And I don't believe that turning around and saying white people are the cause of all your problems is helping any part of that conversation. If you want to sit there and start talking about how it's really white people out to get you, you can go pull down the interracial crimes, right? And when we look at this and we again do the exact same thing, try to find the frequency of rate of interracial crime, well, blacks versus whites, you're 13.6 times more likely to have a black person killing a white person than a white person killing a black person. When you talk about black on black crime, versus white on white crime, it's 5.8 times. It's harsh, but when it comes to lives and them mattering, it really seems overwhelmingly that black lives don't really matter to black people. White lives don't really matter to black people. And that's that's not really a pleasant thing to think about. It's not really pleasant to look through the crime statistics and see that. I don't like it. I know it exists, but I don't like it. We can come up with a giant racism conspiracy theory, but it's really hard to sit there and look at these numbers and not be absolutely appalled. And when we sit there and we start talking about dodging responsibility, about how there isn't really good evidence of things like racism, and how hate crimes are up, and gunfire at cops is up, and how these crimes don't seem to really be reaching a parity state based on population. I think the social justice movement and trying to point the finger at white people is doing a great disservice to a large number of people, because you're not telling them they are responsible for their own actions. You're telling them other people are responsible for their fate and their outcome, and I think that is very detrimental. So I guess ultimately, could it be driving while black? Yeah, it could be. This whole thing could be true. Um, the problem that you have is that it doesn't really look like it. You have to do better data controls, and social science is much more interested in pushing their narrative than they are in controlling their data. And I know this is a little bit of a morose ending, but this actually saddens me. It saddens me. I do not believe that we are helping anybody by attempting to push back on racism when it may not exist. I don't believe that it is beneficial to basically tell entire generations of people that they are oppressed when the evidence does not seem to say that. And I don't think it does anyone any good to tell them that they aren't responsible for their actions. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it is better to lie than it is to turn around and face the actual consequences. But I would argue that in the event that it is a racism problem, then addressing racism may be the appropriate solution. It might not be. But if it's not racism, then sitting there and telling people that it is not only is ignoring the larger underlying problems, but it's also increasing hatred in the communities. And I believe very firmly, based on all of the data that I've looked at, based on all of the studies that I've seen, that this half-assed approach that social science seems to really like to go with to validate their political stances is ultimately not only not having any net gains, but it's doing a significant amount of damage by convincing people that they aren't responsible for their actions. I mean, given the amount of discretion that a police officer has, the amount of power that they ultimately have, ask yourself, telling an entire group of people that they are being discriminated against by the police, is that going to lead to better interpersonal relations with the police, or worse? And the data seems to indicate that it doesn't lead to very good personal interactions. But imagine that scaling up to every single stop, every single arrest, all of those record violations, and think about that there is a distinct possibility, given all of the data and all of the evidence out there, that social justice and driving while black and all of these other terms about racism are actually causing the impacts that they're purportedly attempting to fight. Just think on it.